Hello, my name is Kernon Dillon, and in this Blender tutorial we're going to take a look at how to create a layered snowflake pattern. We'll start by creating the snowflake using basic modeling tools and using Blender's mirror modifier and spin duplication tool. Then we'll create the arrangement of the snowflakes using the scatter and drop script, and along with some manual repositioning just to get things exactly how we want. Then we'll set up render layers for compositing, and then we'll use the composite nodes to apply effects to each render layer. And then we'll spice things up a little bit by using Blender's stars feature, and then finally take a look at how to easily add a background image to the pattern. And that's it. So let's get started. Okay, the first thing we want to do is delete the default cube. Currently we're in the top view, so let's switch to the front view. And then we want to add a mesh plane. And then we'll tab into edit mode, and with all of our vertices selected, we want to move the geometry over to the right of the object's center point. And you can use the control key to snap it to the grid. And this is important because when we apply a mirror modifier, the mirroring takes place along the selected axis, but relative to the object's center point. And make sure you turn on do clipping in the mirror modifier so we can maintain the connection between the two mirror sides. And now we want to move everything up along the z-axis to an arbitrary point. It doesn't really matter. And then just use the right mouse button to drag our vertices around, and also to select vertices and press the E key to extrude and create our shape. And basically we want to create the design for just one arm of the snowflake, and we're going to use spin duplication to rotate that around the object center point to create the rest of the arms of the snowflake. And so we're just extruding, scaling, moving, and rotating. And there's no need to make this too complicated, because once we do the duplication and rotating, it becomes, pretty complex. So you can start with something really simple and end up with something that seems to be more complicated than it is. Okay. And that's good enough. Now select all the geometry and let's move it up further along the z-axis so that when we rotate everything, we have an empty area in the center. And again, it doesn't matter exactly how much you move it away from the center. Then we want to tab into object mode and apply our mirror modifier. And with everything selected in edit mode, recalculate the normals just to make sure everything is pointing outward. And then use the spin duplication tool. We set the degrees to 360 and the steps to 6 because we want to have 6 arms of the snowflake, or spokes. And click spin dupe. Now because we duplicated it 6 times, at the beginning and the end there's going to be duplicate geometry, so we can just select the original geometry and be left with the duplicate. And I'm just going to scale this down a little bit. Now in the edit mode, press Shift D to duplicate everything, and then scale that down, and then rotate with the R key while holding the control button down so that we snap to grid units and rotate it as you see. Okay, now we want to select the innermost vertices from our original pieces that we started with, and then scale them inward so that they are more aligned to the smaller pieces that we duplicated. So we have a more circular shape in the center. And now you just want to select the two disconnected or unconnected vertices and connect them using the F key, which normally creates a face, but since we're only selecting two vertices, it's going to create an edge. And just go all the way around this center part to create one connected piece of geometry. Okay, now that we're done with this, we can see it's pretty sloppy, so we want to actually have a circular shape. I'm going to move this vertex back where it should be. And now let's select all of the vertices in the center part by pressing the B key twice and dragging with the left mouse button and paint selecting all the vertices that we want. And we want this to be in a circular shape, so we can use the to sphere feature, make sure the percentage is 100 and click OK. And now we have a spherical, or in this case a circular shape of the selected geometry. And with that selected, just do a series of extrudes and scales to create a few loops in the center. Again, this is a snowflake, so you can do whatever design you want. And basically we're just going to go all the way down until we do the last extrude and scale, where we'll then press S key to scale and then numpad 0 to scale all of those vertices down to 1 point, and then remove the doubles because we don't want all of those vertices stacked on top of each other. Now switching to face select mode, you can see that of course we've got a few triangles in the center. I'm going to recalculate the normals again just to make sure everything is pointed in the same direction, and select the groups of adjacent triangles, and we're going to convert those to quads using the Alt J key. And this isn't exactly necessary, I just prefer to have as many quads as possible, just as a matter of good practice. And at this point, again, being a snowflake, you can decide what you want to delete and what you want to leave to create some sort of interesting pattern in the center part of the snowflake. So I'm just going to delete every third face along this face loop. Okay. And then do something similar to the next loop of faces. All right. And that's your snowflake. That should be good enough. We'll switch to the front view, scale that down, and let's add a camera from the front view so it'll be pointing towards our snowflake. And let's switch to the camera view and set it to orthographic. And with the camera selected, let's switch to the top view and pull it back a little bit so we can better see our snowflake. And when the camera is set to orthographic, you get a scale parameter that you can use to scale the contents of the camera's view. Not physically scale the objects, but scale how they appear within the camera's view. And let's give the snowflake a name. We'll call it Flake. And give it a basic material. Color it white. And set it to be shadeless, because we won't be needing any shading since we're just going for a simple 2D layout. And this will help our snowflake to be just a plain bright white color. Okay, and that's pretty much it. Now that we've got the snowflake created, now let's look at how we can create the actual pattern layout. Okay, let's begin to create our pattern layout. Let's split this window, and selecting the camera, go to the Edit Buttons window and turn on Passport 2, and that just helps you to focus on what the camera is actually going to render. And let's create a script window for the second window. and go to Object and Scatter and Drop. Now this script will take the selected object and scatter it around within the parameters that you've set. And actually I don't want this off center, so I'm going to reset its location by pressing Alt-G. And we click the Assign button in the scripts interface, and that will assign that object to create copies for it. And we set the number of copies. And for the location parameters, because we're viewing along the y-axis, we want to zero out the y-axis because we want the changes to affect the x and z-axis. And so we set our range values for these parameters. Okay. And for rotation, again, viewing along the y-axis, we want it to rotate around the y-axis. We want each duplicate to have a random rotation. So we set a range of rotation for the y parameter. And we don't want to scale any particular axis for the object. We want to do uniform scaling. And the value of 1 represents the current size of the object. So if we set this to 0.2, it's going to be that object times 0.2. So basically 20% smaller, well, down to 20% of the current size. And setting the maximum to 1.2 will allow for objects that are 20% larger than the current size. And we click the scatter button, and there you have it. Now I'm going to use this script. Well, first of all, let's scale these down a little bit. I turned on the centers only option on the header bar, and that allows you to scale the object's center points. And that essentially allows you to move them around using the scale feature without actually scaling the object itself. It's just scaling the center points, but not the actual geometry. And for this scatter and drop script, because it's a script and we actually want to create something that's a little bit, our own creation, I'm not going to worry about trying to get the parameters just right so it gives me a layout that, I want to keep. So we'll just take what we have here and just manually drag and place things so that we get a layout that we like. And I'm going to actually speed up this section because it's pretty boring to sit here and watch that. So I'll see you on the other side. Okay, we've got our basic layout here for the snowflake pattern. And let's exit the maximize window view. And we want to switch this to a UV image editor so we can display our render results in this window. And we can set that up by going to the output buttons window and the render display control and set it to image editor. And that way we'll get it over there instead of a pop-up window. Let's go to the material buttons and the world buttons sub menu and disable the gradient and make sure the background color is set to solid black. We go to the output windows, disable ray tracing and enable anti-aliasing, and let's do a render. Okay, that's our basic pattern. I'm going to increase the anti-aliasing just a little bit. And that's it. Okay, now let's create our render layers so that we can have control over the different layers of flakes that we want to have in our final render. So now we're in layer 1, and we'll select the camera and then press the M key so that we can move the camera to layer 3. So select the third button and then click OK. And if we go to the layer 3 button, we can see that the camera is isolated on layer 3. Back in layer 1, let's select everything and then press Shift D to duplicate all of the flakes that we've arranged, and then press the Y key to constrain the movement along the Y axis. Switching to a front view with the second layer of flakes that we've just duplicated, press the R key to rotate, and we want to rotate this exactly 180 degrees, so we can just type in 180 on the numpad and then press enter. Okay. So now we want to select these newly duplicated flakes as a group and move all of them to another layer. Let's move them to the second layer. So with them selected, again press the M key and select the second layer button. And now that we're still in layer 1, we can see that we have all of the original flakes. In layer 2, we have the duplicated flakes. And in layer 3, we have the camera. So now we want to shift select each layer button, 1, 2, and 3, so that we have all of those layers enabled simultaneously. Now to set up the render layers, we go to the Output Buttons window under Render Layers, and at the top we can see our pool of layers that we're going to use to create the separate layers. For our first layer, let's call it Front Flakes, and then the layer buttons below that interface, you select the layers that you want to be a part of this particular layer, render layer. So we want layer 1 and layer 3 that has our camera in it. Let's create a new layer and call it Back Flakes. And for that we want the flakes on layer 2 as well as the camera again that's on layer 3. Okay, and that's it. So now we have the front flakes and the camera on layer 1, render layer 1, and the back flakes and the camera on render layer 2. So now we're ready to do some compositing. With our render layers created, we now want to use Blender's compositing nodes to add effects to each layer and also combine everything for our final result. When using Blender's compositing nodes, make sure you go to the Scene Buttons window and enable Do Composite. Now let's open the Node Editor window and enable Used Nodes, and make sure we have the Composite Nodes button selected. And now let's add our first render layer by going to Add, Input, Render Layers. Now with the nodes, it's important to note that you want to input data, and then there's ways to affect that data, and then you want to output that data. So when using compositing nodes, in this case with render layers, we want to make sure we add a render layer node so that we can bring in our scene data for each render layer that we've created. Okay, I'm going to resize this node just a little bit, and we can see that we have our front flakes and our back flakes, and these are the render layers that we created. And there's a render button to the right, but we get an error because we don't have any output. We don't have an output node. So let's add a composite node for the output, and you always have to have a composite output node as the final node in your setup. And you can see in the image editor we have it set to render result and composite. And we click the render button again, and we get a render of what's on the front flakes render layer. Okay, and we can resize this down a little bit, and let's duplicate this layer using Shift D, or this node rather, and let's set it to back flakes. And you can connect the output sockets to the input sockets of other nodes simply by dragging between the sockets. And rendering this render layer, we see the back flakes. So we have the back flakes and the front flakes separated in our composite nodes. You can delete the connection between nodes by dragging with the left mouse button And when you release the mouse button, those connections will be erased. Okay, now we've got both of our render layers set up in the compositor, and we've got a composite output node, and ultimately we want to combine the two render layers. But first, let's create some effects for each layer. So with the front flakes render layer selected, we want to add a filter glare. And you'll also notice that since we had the front flakes render layer selected at the time that we added a new node, they are already connected. The default output from that layer is connected to the default input of the node that we're adding. And let's connect this to the composite output node. And you'll notice in the glare node that we have different ways that we can create glare effects and glow effects. And I'm going to increase the streaks to 6 because we have 6 major arms on each snowflake, and that'll help give us a nice streak on each one of those. And you want to adjust the threshold to determine the range of the effects in the image, and that will vary based on the content of your source image. And the fade parameter will allow us to adjust how the streaks fade, basically how long the streaks will be. So if you want them a little bit shorter, you can turn down the fade value. Okay, and we'll keep it simple and subtle. We can always come back and change things. Okay, so that's render layer 1. Render layer 2 with the back flakes, let's add a blur filter. And we're going to connect that to the composite output node. So we have our original scene plus the blur node. And let's adjust the amount for the X and Y axis. We'll set it to 6. And that's the result. So now we have an effect on our second layer and our first layer. So the task at this point is to combine the two into one final scene. So now let's add a color mix node. And you can tell by the name that this is going to allow us to mix two different things. So we connect both of our render layers, and then we connect the output to the input on the composite node. And we can see a mixture between the foreground and the background render layers. And you can use the alpha button to take advantage of any alpha values you have in your original scene, and adjust the factor to determine the ratio of the mixture. Okay. Now that's one way we can combine both layers. Let's look at another node that we can use. Let's add a alpha over node, and we connect that to the composite, and then we connect our other render layer into it. So basically this is going to allow us to combine two different inputs using the alpha channel to determine how things get combined. And let's increase the size of the render so we can get a better look. Okay, and let's maximize that render window, and you can see we have our glare effects on the render layer number 1, the front flakes, and then we have the blurred render layer number 2. Okay, so at this point we have our scene composited with the layers, but let's see what else we can do to increase the appeal of our pattern. Let's add a color mixture node to the end of this, and what this will allow us to do is to take all of the results that we've accumulated so far in the nodes. We've got our 2 render layers with effects on each layer combined using the alpha over node, and then adding this mix node to the end will allow us to take all of those results and combine it with something else using the socket that's at the very bottom of the mix node. And what we'll do is just use that color palette that you see, and that will allow us to change the color. So we have a color mixture with all of our existing results, and that will give us another way to vary the pattern and create some different looks. So we just select the color palette and change the color. Okay, and we can, again, since this isn't a nodal setup, we can continue to tweak other things. And in the mix node you also have different blend modes, the same blend modes you're used to seeing in Photoshop or GIMP, and so you can take advantage of that as well. Okay, and I'm going to just demonstrate some different colors here. And another thing to note is that with the addition of this last node, the mix node, that we now have set to add, we can also pipe in another whole series of nodes into that one socket. So you could add another render layer and pipe that into that bottom socket on the last node that we've added. And that's how nodes can grow and appear to be more complex than they are, but during the creation process it's really just a linear thought pattern. When you see the final node setup, it can appear to be really complex, and that can often be one of the confusing aspects of approaching using Blender's compositing nodes, is that you're seeing the final result of a lot of really simple decisions that were done in a linear fashion. And it can just seem like it's more than what it really is. So just take the approach of just one step at a time, break things down into components or render layers, and it gives you a lot of flexibility to adjust things at different points. And here we have our results with a different color using just simply the color palette on this one node. Okay, and I think the streaks effect are a bit strong now, so I'm going to diminish them a little bit by turning down the fade value. And now let's add something to the secondary render layer here. Let's add a color RGB curves node. Okay, and before we get started with that, let's clean up our node layout. You can click on the widget in the upper left hand corner of each node to minimize that node, and that just helps to clean things up a little bit. And then we want to take the RGB curves node and pipe that into the alpha over node. And with that, we can adjust the curves to affect even more the results that we're getting for the backflakes render layer. And you can see we can create something that's drastically different from our original render just by adjusting these curves. It has the appearance of being geometry that's different, from the front layer, but in fact it's just the same geometry. So this is a good way to get some additional variety and complexity in an otherwise simple render. Okay. And I think I'm going to change the color. And that's it. One thing I do notice, I don't like how some of the snowflakes are overlapping, so one of the great things of having the compositor built into Blender is that we can go back to our original scene. I'll just change this window to a 3D view and go to the camera view. And I just want to change the position of some of these snowflakes. And then if I hit F12 again and do another render, we can see our results. And I'm going to go back and edit some more of these flakes just to get a little bit better layout, and I'll do that as a time lapse. Okay, I think that's good enough. All right, let's come out of this maximized view with Control up arrow, and let's maximize the render in the UV image editor and do another render with F12, and we can see our final layout. Okay, and at this point I just want to show you another way that you can be a little bit more efficient with getting an understanding of what's going on in your nodes by using a viewer node. And a viewer node will allow you to see the output of any particular node that it's attached to in your node setup. And a lot of times you'll see node setups that have a ton of nodes, but oftentimes half of those nodes are viewer nodes. And it's not always necessary to have so many viewer nodes. So let's look at how we can add just one viewer node and use that one viewer node to see what the output is of any node that it's attached to. Now to do this, we need to make sure we enable the backdrop feature. And the backdrop feature will show us in the backdrop behind the nodes whatever the viewer node would see. So with our viewer node attached, you can now control left mouse button onto any node, and that will snap the viewer node to that particular node, and you will see an update in the backdrop area of what that node's output is currently set to. Okay. And that's a really quick way to jump around your node setup and to tweak things without having to clutter your node setup with a bunch of viewer nodes. Sometimes you need a lot of viewer nodes if you need to see things at the same time. You can look at the preview in the viewer node, but if you just need to see the output from one particular node, then I think this is the way to go, to use the control left mouse button. And this backdrop area here normally would remain updated, but I think my video recording software is affecting that area, so you might see it drop out every now and then, like it did just there. Okay, so as a quick review, we have our 3D view set up. That's how we have things set up in the 3D scene. And then we set up render layers, 2 render layers for the front and back. And then we made sure everything is separated, of course. We have everything on different layers. And with all of the layers set up and selected, we can set up our render layers. And then we went into the nodes and separated everything, and then added effects, and then combined the results. And this is the resulting pattern. And that's it. In the next section, we'll use Blender's stars feature to add another element to the snowflake pattern. Okay, before adding the stars, I want to clean up the interface a little bit. Okay, and let's get the backdrop set up again. Okay, and now let's add these stars. We want to go to the shading buttons window, and then the world buttons subcontext, and then locate the mist, stars, and physics panel, and enable the stars feature. And you'll see a preview in the preview panel. The star distance parameter allows you to control the space between the stars. So lowering it will decrease the space between the stars, and you'll see more of them. And the minimum distance parameter allows you to control the distance from the camera that the stars actually begin to be created, and that's more of a 3D space issue. The size parameter allows you to control the size of the stars. And the color noise parameter allows you to add random colorization to the stars, and the slider simply allows you to control the saturation level of the colors. Now switching to a camera view, you can get a better idea of what kind of star effect you're going to get as far as the density of the stars. And so it's a good idea to check that. It's a better preview than what you get in the preview panel. Okay, I'm going to try a few different things here. Let's decrease the distance between the stars and lower the minimum distance, and that'll help to bring more stars into view. And do a test render. Okay. And that doesn't look too bad. Let's try a couple of other things. Let's lower the distance all the way down to the minimum of 2. And let's see what that looks like. It's probably going to be too busy. Yeah. I think that's a little bit too much. But let's also test bringing down the saturation of the color for the stars. Okay. And I don't like that at all. So let's just increase the saturation all the way up to the maximum. Let's spread the stars out a little bit more. Let's increase the minimum distance, so that'll help to thin out the star field a little bit. And I think that's going to work as the final result for the stars. Okay. And back in the nodes, again, we can adjust the background color as well and see what kind of results we get. And that's it. Okay, in this final section, we want to take a look at how we can easily add a background image to our pattern. And we're going to use the image socket on the add node. So let's add another input, and we can make it an image or texture input. Let's make it an image. And then we connect that to the image input socket on the add node. So instead of the background color that we were using earlier, we now have an image that we've just loaded. And we can also increase the size of this node to get a better look at our image. And we can also tweak the parameters of the node that we're connecting to. And in this case, we can determine the balance between the two inputs for the add node using the factor parameter. And that's it.